Hollywood's golden age was built on visibility. Stars were expected to be seen, admired, photographed, interviewed, and endlessly consumed, their presence reinforcing the illusion that fame was both a reward and a privilege. Yet not every star wanted that bargain, and not every disappearance came with scandal, tragedy, or death. Some vanishings were quieter, more confusing, and far more unsettling because they came from people who were still alive, still admired, and still capable of success, people who simply stopped participating. And as you listen to this story, it's worth asking yourself a question that Hollywood never wanted audiences to ask. What happens when a star succeeds, but does not want to exist as a star at all? Jean Arthur was one of the most beloved actresses of the 1930s and early 1940s, a defining face of romantic comedies and screwball classics that shaped American cinema itself. Audiences adored her warmth, her nervous energy, her unmistakable voice, and the sense that she felt real in a world increasingly built on artifice. Yet behind that approachable screen presence was a woman deeply uncomfortable with fame, profoundly anxious, and increasingly overwhelmed by the expectations placed upon her. And unlike many of her contemporaries, Jean Arthur would not burn out, self-destruct, or be publicly disgraced. Instead, she would do something Hollywood found far more threatening. She would slowly disappear by choice. Rise beloved without wanting to be known, Jean Arthur rose to prominence during an era when studios carefully engineered personalities, assigning stars rigid identities that could be marketed reliably. But Arthur never fit cleanly into those boxes. She was not aloof enough to be untouchable, nor extravagant enough to be dazzling in the traditional sense. Instead, she offered sincerity, vulnerability, and emotional immediacy, qualities that audiences connected with instinctively. By the mid-1930s, she had become a staple of prestigious films, working with major directors and appearing in movies that are still studied today as pillars of Golden Age Hollywood. Off-screen, however, Arthur was strikingly different from the confident women she portrayed. She was intensely private. While other stars learned to navigate publicity as part of the job, Arthur recoiled from it, avoiding interviews, resisting promotional events, and withdrawing whenever possible. And this creates an important tension at the heart of her story. What happens when the audience loves you more than you love the life that love demands? Despite her discomfort, Arthur remained professional, generous, and widely respected by colleagues. She showed up, delivered nuanced performances, and avoided scandal, which made her eventual disappearance even more confusing. There was no obvious reason for her to leave. She was successful, bankable, and admired. And yet, beneath that success, the pressure was accumulating quietly. Cracks when success becomes suffocating as the 1940s approached. The studio system intensified its demands, tightening control over contracts, appearances, and personal narratives. For someone like Jean Arthur, whose temperament leaned towards solitude and reflection, this environment was not merely stressful, it was suffocating. She struggled with anxiety and depression at a time when mental health was poorly understood and rarely addressed with compassion. Instead of support, she encountered expectation: smile more, appear grateful, continue performing. Arthur began stepping away intermittently, taking breaks that puzzled studio executives and alarmed the industry press. Each absence was treated as temporary, a pause rather than a warning, because Hollywood assumed that no star would willingly abandon the privileges it offered. But Arthur's relationship with fame was never transactional. She did not measure success in applause or headlines, and this made her increasingly incompatible with the system that sustained her career. What's particularly striking is that Jean Arthur was not pushed out. She was not labeled difficult in the traditional sense, nor was she discarded when her popularity faded. She was still wanted, still admired, still offered roles, and yet she increasingly declined them, retreating further from the public eye. And that raises a question Hollywood never wanted to answer honestly: what if disappearing is not failure, but self-preservation? The turn walking away. While still loved by the mid-1940s, Jean Arthur began withdrawing almost completely from the industry. Unlike stars whose careers ended abruptly, she simply stopped participating. This kind of disappearance was deeply unsettling to Hollywood because it disrupted the usual narrative. Stars were supposed to be either triumphant or tragic, celebrated or destroyed. Arthur was neither. She was successful, alive, and intentionally invisible. And because the industry had no framework for that choice, it quietly allowed her to fade, shifting attention elsewhere while leaving questions unanswered. Audiences noticed. Critics wondered. But without drama, the story lost momentum, and Jean Arthur's absence became normalized. And perhaps this is the most unsettling aspect of all, how easily the world adjusts when someone stops asking to be seen. After the exit, living without an audience. When Jean Arthur stepped away from Hollywood, she did not vanish in a tragedy, scandal, or obscurity in the way audiences had been conditioned to expect. Instead, she did something far more radical for a Golden Age star. She lived quietly, deliberately, and without spectacle. There were no dramatic interviews explaining her absence, no tell-all memoirs reframing her career, and no attempts to reclaim attention through nostalgia or reinvention. And this raises an unsettling question that rarely gets asked. What does it mean when a star leaves not because they must, but because they choose peace over presence? Arthur retreated from public life almost entirely, avoiding the industry that had made her famous while still carrying the psychological weight of having once belonged to it. She did not reject acting itself so much as the machinery surrounding it. The constant scrutiny, the loss of privacy, and the expectation that gratitude should replace consent. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she did not cling to relevance or attempt to adapt herself to a changing Hollywood. She simply stepped aside, allowing the world to move on without her participation. What's striking is how little resistance the industry offered once her withdrawal became permanent. Studios moved on. New stars replaced old ones. The machine continued functioning as if nothing had been lost. And perhaps that realization, that the system does not collapse when one person leaves, is part of what makes her disappearance so quietly devastating. If fame can be abandoned without consequence, what does that say about how replaceable even the most beloved figures truly were? Attempts to return. The world had changed. Jean Arthur did make brief attempts to re-enter public life, but each return revealed a deeper truth. Hollywood had changed, and so had its expectations. The post-war industry was louder, faster, and less forgiving of introspection. The kind of vulnerability that once defined Arthur's appeal was no longer fashionable, and the patience that had once existed for quiet performers had evaporated. When she appeared sporadically in theater and occasional film projects, the experience only reinforced what she already sensed. The world she had once inhabited no longer existed in a form she could survive within. These moments are important because they dismantle the myth that disappearing is always final or absolute. Arthur did not vanish because she lost her talent or relevance. She vanished because returning required becoming someone she was not willing to be. And this leads to a difficult reflection. Is disappearance still a loss if returning would mean self-betrayal? Instead of forcing herself into an industry that no longer aligned with her inner life, Arthur chose retreat again, this time more permanently. She avoided public appearances, declined interviews, and resisted the nostalgia circuit that often pulls retired stars back into visibility. Her refusal to capitalize on her legacy confused historians and fans alike, but it also preserved something rare: authenticity. How Hollywood remembered her, fondly, but from a distance. Hollywood never turned on Jean Arthur. There was no public shaming, no campaign to discredit her, no attempt to rewrite her as difficult or unstable. Instead, the industry did something arguably more revealing. It remembered her fondly, but vaguely. She became a name associated with a certain era, a certain feeling, a certain tone of film, without remaining a living presence in the cultural conversation. This kind of remembrance is deceptively gentle. It lacks cruelty, but it also lacks engagement. Arthur was celebrated in retrospectives, praised by critics, and admired by filmmakers who studied her work, yet she herself remained distant, untouched by the attention her legacy continued to generate. And this raises an important question about how disappearance functions in cultural memory. Is it possible to honor someone's work while quietly accepting their absence as inevitable? In many ways, Jean Arthur became a symbol rather than a person, an emblem of sincerity in a system that gradually lost patience for it. The industry did not erase her achievements, But it also did not interrogate why she left, because doing so would have required acknowledging that success does not guarantee fulfillment. The human cost, what her silence tells us. Jean Arthur lived for many years after leaving Hollywood, largely unseen and unheard from, carrying with her the knowledge that she had walked away from something millions would have given anything to possess. Yet her life challenges one of the most persistent myths of fame, that visibility is inherently valuable, and that disappearance is inherently tragic. Arthur's withdrawal suggests a different possibility, that sometimes survival requires invisibility. Her story forces us to reconsider how we define success, especially in industries built on constant exposure. She was not destroyed by Hollywood, nor was she discarded when her usefulness ended. She left because remaining would have required emotional sacrifice she was unwilling to make. And that distinction matters, because it reframes disappearance not as failure, but as boundary setting. At the same time, her absence exposes how little space the Golden Age made for mental health, privacy, and personal autonomy. Arthur's anxiety and depression were not treated as realities to be supported, but as inconveniences to be managed quietly. The system functioned smoothly as long as stars performed, regardless of the internal cost. And when someone stepped away for self-preservation, the system adapted instantly, leaving the individual to carry the consequences alone. Legacy: a star who refused the myth. Today, Jean Arthur is remembered primarily through her films, through characters who feel alive, nervous, earnest, and deeply human. What is